4 at this point. So,
all right. Well, it is 6 o'clock. So I think we'll go ahead and get started then. So first, I just want to welcome everyone to Journey Down the Clackamas Conference. I'm Glenn Ahrens. I'm the OSU Extension Forester for Clackamas, Marion, and Hood River County. And I had the pleasure of working with Dave Bugney and the steering committee and the Clackamas River Basin Council on organizing the forestry sessions for this. And so this has been great to do. And I'm real happy to see tonight's show lined up and our speakers all here from different parts of the world. Somebody's across the country actually to join us here. So while we wait for people to log on, feel free, to chat with amongst yourselves, and also, you can put your information in the Google Sheet that we've created to help people network, and that's going to be posted in the chat. So thank you for joining us this evening. This is our 13th session of Journey Down the Clackamas. I'm Glenn Ahrens, as I said, your OSU Extension Forester in Clackamas, Marion, Hood River County. And then also helping tonight, Todd Bartlett from the Clackamas River Basin Council is also incoming board chair, and he's going to be assisting with the technical aspects of this. He's an old hand at this by now on our 13th session. I got a few items to cover before we get started. The Clackamas River Basin Council is celebrating its 25th year anniversary. Since founding 1996, CRBC has worked as a non-governmental group of stakeholders to protect and improve the Clackamas River Basin and its tributaries. The mission is to foster partnerships for clean water and to improve fish and wildlife habitat and the quality of life for all who live, work, and recreate in the Clackamas River watershed. On behalf of the Basin Council, I'd like to thank our 2 gold sponsors, Oregon Beverage Recycling Cooperative and the Clackamas Water Environmental Services. There's a 1-minute video that we're going to show that describes what the recycling cooperative does. I think, maybe not.
yeah, we'll get there. Just 1 second.
All right, we'll give a chance for that video to start. We'll also thank our bronze sponsors, Clackamas River Water Providers and the Geological Society of the Oregon Country, and also the Metro Council Government. So that is our sponsors, and we'll see if the, here we go. This is a
If you live in Oregon, you probably know that most of the beverages you buy have a 10-cent redemption value. That small deposit has big returns, helping to keep our environment clean and green. And speaking of green, we have an easy way to collect and redeem your containers. Bottle Drop Green Bags. It's the simplest, fastest way to make sure you get back every dime. Start by creating a Bottle Drop account, either online or at a kiosk located at many grocery stores and Bottle Drop locations. Once you're signed up, it's time to gear up. That starts with getting your digital Bottle Drop card online or right from the kiosk. You'll also get your bag tag stickers here. And while you're shopping, you can purchase a roll of green bags. Now you're ready. Take your bags home, fill them up with empties, tie them up tight, and be sure to stick a bag tag on each of them. When they're full, take your bags to any drop door near you. Scan your Bottle Drop card to unlock the door and to record your visit with us. Then simply drop your bags, close the door, and let Bottle Drop's advanced tracking technology take it from here. Our team uses a system of scanners, cameras, RFID, and other smart technology to track your bag and your refunds, from the moment you scan your card at the door drop until your account is credited. Every single bottle and can is counted, sorted, compacted, and processed so that the materials can be used again. They'll see new life, and you'll see the credit on your account within 7 days. Then you can visit a kiosk to grab your cash, or you can use your Bottle Drop account to donate to great causes, save toward education, or get 20% more in refunds when you choose Bottle Drop Plus. No matter how you take your refunds, you can also take pride in knowing that you're making a difference for our community and the planet. Bottle Drop. Small deposit, big return.
All right, thank you, Bottle Drop. Also, thanks to many individuals who have donated to support the conference. We continue to seek additional donations, which are tax deductible. And the Clackamas River Basin has been occupied by Native peoples for millennia. So just to acknowledge those who came before, it's the original territory of the Clackamas, Chinook, Molalla, Kalapuya, and other peoples. Currently recognized as lands of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs and belongs to other Native peoples who may not be federally recognized. We thank those who came before us for their stewardship of these lands and waters, and those who continue to steward them now and in the future. We're gathered for this journey down the Clackamas to learn in-depth information about the basin and its connections to Oregon as a whole, and to connect with each other so that we can support our mutual efforts to protect and improve the Clackamas River and its tributaries, and to have some educational fun. That's certainly my top priority as your extension forester. CRBC is partnering with the Environmental Learning Center at Clackamas Community College. Workshop attendees will receive a signed certificate of completion for each session. And if you'd like a certificate of completion, add your contact information to our Journey Down the Clackamas Conference Networking Google Sheet and indicate that you'd like a certificate in the G column. We'll forward your contact information to Clackamas Community College. I'd like to share just a few ground rules for the Zoom session before I introduce our guests tonight. Please keep your microphones on mute unless invited to participate. And you can keep your cameras off if you like. Keeping the camera off will help us save bandwidth for our presenter and greatly reduce the carbon footprint of our meeting. We will have 3 presenters this evening, and then myself as moderator with a few things to say. And please type your questions in the chat, and we'll select from there and curate the questions with our presenters. And feel free to send direct chats to friends that you're seeing in the participant list. So now we'll start our presentation for this evening. And remember to type your questions in the chat, keep yourself muted, and we'll answer questions at the end of the presentation. Each of our speakers actually is allocated a little time in case there's some burning questions right after their talk for the 3 different presentations. We're going to be going till about 7:45 and then more time for questions after that. So with that, I'm going to introduce all of our speakers. I'm going to give you their background, and then we'll start off with our first speaker, which is Matt Reilly. So Dr. Reilly is a forest ecologist with the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station and the Western Wildland Environmental Threat Assessment Center. Matt holds a PhD in forest science from Oregon State University. His research integrates field data, remote sensing, historical records to study vegetation response to disturbance, land use, and climate change. And of course, a big disturbance that he's going to talk about tonight is wildfire. Our next speaker after Matt Reilly is Dr. Morris Johnson. He's a research fire ecologist in the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station in the Pacific Wildland Fire Sciences Laboratory, which is in Seattle, Washington. His research focus is quantifying silvicultural treatment effects on changing wildfire behavior and understanding post-wildfire forest and fuel succession following large stand replacing wildfires. Very pertinent topic in the Clackamas River Basin. Dr. Johnson earned a PhD degree in ecosystem analysis from the University of Washington. And then our third speaker tonight, Rebecca Flitcroft. Dr. Flickcroft is a research fish biologist with the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station in Corvallis. Rebecca's research explores holistic approaches to watershed analysis and management. And she's particularly interested in how physical features and the environmental conditions affect life history, expression, and diversity in native aquatic biota. So this is a great panel, and it's my pleasure to help put it together. Thank you, Matthew, Morris, and Rebecca. And let's start off with you, Matt.
Great, thanks for the introduction, Glenn, and thanks everyone for coming out this evening and giving us a chance to share a little bit of our perspectives on fire here and how they might apply in the Clackamas River Basin. And I'm just going to take a moment and share my screen with y'all. And I think that's up there. Can everybody see title slide?
Yes, it's there.
Great, thanks. And if I do start coming in and out or anything, and there appear to be bandwidth issues on my end, please do interrupt, and I can turn my camera off. Yeah, so today I'm going to give you sort of a brief preview and introduction to fire ecology and west side forests of the Pacific Northwest, and try and give you some ecological understanding for putting the fires of last fall in context and thinking about fires in the future and what we might be able to do to adapt to such situations should they arise again. And I just wanted to briefly acknowledge a number of my collaborators who have sort of helped me through with my thinking and on Westside Fire and lots of conversations. This has been a topic we've been thinking about for years. So there's been folks from the Forest Service, the Washington Department of Natural Resources, Oregon State University, as well as University of Washington. And obviously, you know, fire on the west side is a growing concern. And I think the issue really came to the forefront in 2017 with the Eagle Creek fire that was burning in the Columbia River Gorge. And certainly after last fall is really on everyone's mind west of the Cascades. And what I have here is just a map of Pacific Northwest fires from 1985 till 2010. And what you'll notice is this really distinctive line that sort of creeps down the Cascade crest and then cuts across sort of the Umpqua region and Southwest Oregon. And this is the area I'm sort of referring to as the west side. And when we think about fire on the west side, it really is kind of a different beast than we think about fire in the rest of the region. And we're going to dig into that a bit more in some subsequent slides. But yeah, it really is sort of a different ecological phenomenon. And along with that, sort of our evidence and knowledge base about the historical role of fire on the west side really differs from that of the east side. And I think the best place to start thinking about that in terms of context for understanding about, you know, regional scale fire regimes and geographic patterns is thinking about the unique fire environment that we have here on the west side. And when we think about the fire environment, I like to use this term spatially varying constraints. There isn't really one specific factor that plays the dominant role necessarily in fire and how the frequency and patterns of severity vary at a regional scale. And so we have these three factors: ignition, drought, and weather. And I'm just going to show you maps of Oregon, Washington, and Northern California to give you some idea of how they vary and how that plays into historical fire regimes and even into contemporary fire regimes. And so here I have a map of lightning frequency. This is, I think, from the 70s till the maybe 2010. But what really pops out is across much of the west side, there isn't a whole lot of lightning. You get down into the southern portions of the Western Cascades, the southern part of the Willamette National Forest, the Umpqua region, and there is quite a bit of lighting, but you know, large areas of the Coast Range, the Olympic Peninsula, and the northern parts of the Western Cascades don't see a whole lot of lightning. And historically, you know, humans played a really important role in ignition. Certainly in the Willamette Valley, indigenous tribes were burning, you know, almost on an annual basis to maintain some of those white oak savannas. But also there's evidence further up into the mountains, even into some of the more remote areas where tribes were burning to maintain foods like huckleberries and things like bear grass and promote resources. So humans have always been a very, very important part of the regional fire environment here in the Pacific Northwest. The second factor to think about is summer drought. And of course, we have a Mediterranean climate here in the Pacific Northwest. We receive most of our precipitation in the winter. The summers are really, really warm and dry. We seldom see rain during the summer months. But what I want to point out here is that there is still a tremendous amount of variability in the intensity of summer drought across the region. And so you see northern Washington is generally wetter and cooler, along with some of the higher elevations in the Cascades. And then at lower elevations, it's much, much warmer and drier. And so all these factors play into essentially how dry the fuels are when there is an ignition. And then finally, the third factor that we want to think about is weather. And I have here a map of, this is the frequency of dry east wind events. And normally in the summertime during our fire season, you know, we get our winds off the Pacific Ocean and they're generally cool and moist. But you know, as everybody is well aware of after last fall, occasionally we get these synoptic weather events where we have really, really hot, dry winds that come down from the crest of the Cascades into the west side. And, drove the fires last fall and are really, really associated with a lot of the large historical fires that we know of here in the region. And this is just grid climate data. And we've basically used a threshold of when the relative humidity drops below about 36%, and average wind speed is above, I think, 4 or 5 meters per second. And what you see are there's some real hot spots that pop out where we see these wind events are more frequent than other parts of the region. And so we have really these three factors. And as we know from last fall, where we had the ignition, the drought, and the weather, when these factors really, really come together, we can have these really, really huge stand replacing fires. And when we put all these factors together, we have what fire ecologists use the term as a historical fire regime. And I have a map here on the left of different regimes across the region and how those different factors are expressed ecologically in terms of fire and how frequent and severe it is. And so these historical fire regimes are sort of based on an understanding that goes back, maybe the last 500 years from different fire history studies. And if you look at the figure on the right, we generally conceptualize these based on two different factors. And so we have fire frequency on the x-axis. So, how frequent fire is, whether it's every 10 or 15 years, like you might have on the east side, or every 75, 100, or 200 years, like we might have on the west side. And then on the y-axis is the proportion of the total area burned at high severity. And so what you'll see is I have a series of 4 different mosaics. And in the bottom right, we have a frequent low severity regime that would be similar to what you would see in the dry forests of the east side, where most of the area is burned at lower moderate severity, leaves lots of standing trees. And the high severity patches are generally very, very limited and small and make up a small proportion of the area. And then as you go further to the top right, we have what we call an infrequent high severity regime, where fires occur maybe every century, maybe every couple centuries when the conditions align. But when they do align, we have these really, really large high severity fires. And I think we'll start sort of in the beginning here and focus on these more frequent regimes, which I think folks generally have a pretty good grasp of. And this frequent low severity regime is really what we see on the east side of the Cascade. So if you go over to Sisters or Bend, this is the historical fire regime. It's certainly characteristic of low elevation oak woodlands in the Willamette Valley and even parts of the Puget Trough. And generally conditions for burning are common. They happen every year. It's hot enough and dry enough. And really what limits fire frequency and behavior and the subsequent severity is fuel productivity. And so I have a schematic here, a little diagram from Bob Van Pelt that sort of gives a time series of a historical frequent low severity fire regime, where at time 0, you have a low density forest dominated by big trees. Maybe every 20 years or so, without fire suppression, you have a low severity fire that kills some of the smaller trees and leaves this big backbone of large ponderosa pine forests. And of course, our scientific basis for this, ponderosa pine is really a great species for documenting historical fire regimes. These frequent fires generally leave scars on the trees, and we can go into stumps and things like that and cut out cross sections and look back in time and precisely date how frequent fires occurred and look at how they correlated with climate and things like that at centennial scales. And I think everyone sort of knows the story of fire exclusion. Since about the mid or late 1800s, there was all this grazing that eliminated a lot of the grassy, fine understory fuels on the east side. We started putting fires out, very, very effective with fire suppression. And as a result, we had these changes in density where we have more trees and we have different species of trees. So we have more shade tolerant species that historically would have been killed in these frequent low severity fires. And ultimately what we've seen is this increased potential for uncharacteristic fire behavior and effects. And so these large patches of high severity fire that you see in some of these places on the east side. And again, here's another schematic from Bob Van Pelt showing effects of fire exclusion, where after 80 years, you have these increased densities in trees are more susceptible to high severity fire and insect outbreaks and things like that. And, you know, one of the major ecological concerns is the loss of these old legacy trees that have been around for centuries. And then you have, you know, certainly the bootleg fire would be a great example of an uncharacteristic contemporary fire that is largely the result of past management activities. And so if we shift to these more infrequent fire regimes that I'm going to focus on today, we have this moderate mixed severity regime where you might have fires every 35 to 75 years, or this infrequent regime every, say, 125 to 300 years. We have these really different landscape patterns. And if you look at the map on the right, I have the distribution of the largest of the 2020 fires in the west side, and you can see that they covered both of these regimes. Again, fuels are not limiting. These are very, very productive forests. Generally ignition is limiting, or those high severity wind events. And the evidence that we have for these west side fire regimes, these less frequent fire regimes, is a little bit different. Douglas fir, which is our dominant early cereal or shade intolerant species, does not really scar like ponderosa pine does. And so what I have here is a figure from some of Tom Spies's work, where he went out and put plots all across the Cascade Range and the Coast Range. And what he did was he took observations of large Douglas fir, these fire-resistant trees that had basically char on their bark as evidence of past fires where these large trees had survived. And what he found when you plotted these on a latitudinal gradient, so going from south to north, there's this very, very distinctive line at about Salem, where all of a sudden you start seeing very few of these large fire-resistant trees that have char on their bark. And so we have this place that's sort of along the Mackenzie River. You tend to see less lightning north of this line, and also less intense summer drought. And so we have this transition, but you know, these large wind-driven high severity fires are really part of both regimes, and that's primarily what we're going to focus on today. And in terms of the other scientific evidence that we have, primarily these come from fire history studies, and I have here some results from the closest fire history study I could find to the Clackamas River from the Boron Watershed. This is from some of Jim Agee's work, and what he did he went in and aged trees, and what happens after these large high severity fires is that you get most of the trees are killed, and you have these periods of establishment of Douglas fir and what we call cohorts. And so if you go out and you core in aged trees, generally what you'll find is a large pulse of trees that date back to about the same time period. And using some of these dendroecological methods, he's recreated here some of the historical fires in the Bull Run watershed. And there's a map of some of those. Some of them are much larger than others. Some of them are different places. But generally on centennial scales, there was fires every century or so. And what he found when he averaged over the last 5 centuries, that the average fire rotation, or the period of time that it took to completely burn that Bull Run watershed, 26,000 hectares, or I don't know, a little over 60,000 acres, every 350 years or so that happened. And so, you know, we have fire history studies from Northern Washington that demonstrate similar things. And the other real piece that we have that is really the focus of a lot of our West Side fire knowledge is these historical maps. And what I have here are maps from some of the early explorers in the 1902, I think these were made. And what these folks did when they were doing early forest surveys was they went out to some of the more remote mountain peaks and looked out across the landscape and just sort of drew lines around the perimeters where they had seen stand replacing fires. And so, you know, if you were to zoom out on the west side of Oregon and Washington, these patches here are what you would see large stand replacing fires, very, very extensive, very, very large. And in this case, what we're looking at is really probably the legacy of fires in the Coast Range, at least in the 1850s and late 1800s. And then in the Cascades, more recent around the early 1900s. And so these are sort of 2 of the main pieces of evidence we have for this infrequent high severity regime. And then moving on to this moderate severity regime, we have folks that used similar methods. Fred Swanson and his students did this work out of the Forest Sciences Lab down in Corvallis. And what they did was back in the early 90s, when they were cutting a lot of old growth forests, they would go out to old stumps and cut cross sections. And out in the field, they could look back in the Douglas fir growth history and actually see evidence of scars, and they could date them. And what they did, a lot of our picture from this regime here comes from this series of maybe 8 or 9 studies, and primarily in Oregon. And if you look in the figure on the middle, what they document are these 2 periods of widespread fire on the west side, where, you know, prior to 1600, we were sort of in this what they call the medieval climate anomaly. It was much warmer and drier, and there was a lot of fire for those centuries there. And then in the 1600s, it started cooling down, and we went into what's called the Little Ice Age, and we had a limited period of fire. In the late 1700s, we also saw the extirpation of Native American populations that were a primary source of ignition. And, you know, between 1800 and 1850, we saw a lot of European settlers that came in and were lighting fires, and that's sort of the signal you see there. And of course, it stops in about 1900, or probably about 1930s is when that stops. And then another piece of evidence we have from some of Alan Tepley's work, which should have demonstrated the complexity of different ways that forests develop in the Western Cascades near the H.J. Andrews, where they found that about 25% followed this line that you see up on top, where there's a large stand replacing fire that sort of went through successional phases to old growth without another fire. But most of the other areas that he sampled were the result of basically these lower severity non-stand replacing fires that might happen every 50 to 75 years, but again, on centennial scales, were punctuated by these large stand replacing fires. And so thinking back, you know, these large high severity fires are really part of the normal historical fire regime on the west side. And again, we have what we think is a fairly clear recipe from what we saw in the early 20th century and what we've seen in 2020 about sort of the 3 major ingredients. And the first, of course, is an ignition. The second, of course, is very, very dry conditions. And then the third is these dry east wind events that are relatively infrequent, but do occur in almost a somewhat predictable manner on an annual basis in some cases. And most of the knowledge that we have about these dry east wind events comes from early research in the 1950s from a fellow named Owen Kramer. And what Kramer did was he went up to the Portland airport and harvested some of the data they had been collecting there from weather balloons. And so every day they would send these weather balloons up into the upper atmosphere and record data on wind speed and relative humidity. And he came up with this threshold, basically with a relative humidity of less than 36%. So things are very, very dry, not a lot of moisture in the air. And then average daily wind speeds are greater than 6 meters per second. And so 6 meters per second average daily wind speed is a little tough for folks to get a grasp of, but I think during the Eagle Creek fire, some of the peak wind speeds that they saw were about 2 meters per second on a daily average, whereas in some of these 2020 fires, we were up above 10 or 15 or even 25 in some cases. So it doesn't sound like a lot, but it's certainly enough to drive some of these large fires. And what I did here was I took some of the data from this Kramer paper and I plotted the average number of wind days and how they change over time. And what really, really emerges is this very, very distinctive, what I call window of vulnerability in terms of when these dry east wind events pop up. And I have just a handful of some of the historical fires that we actually have dates for going back into the early part of the 20th century. The Tillmark fire, late August 1933. Of course, last September 7th to 9th, the Labor Day fires of 2020. The Yakult fire, also the Columbia burn that affected parts of Oregon just south of the gorge, September 11th, 1902. The Suisun burn burned, I think, over 200,000 acres in Southwest Washington in 1929. September 26th, the 1936 Bandon fire down in the Coast Range. And if you read through some of the early studies from the 1900s, they go through and document firsthand observations on some of the smoke and things like that in Portland. And the observations and the timing, the seasonality of those fires are really, they really have an eerie similarity to what happened in the last fall. And so they are somewhat unpredictable on an annual basis, but we know when they are more frequent to occur. And we've also been doing some map to try and understand geographic patterns of these east wind events. And I showed you this figure early on when we were talking about the regional and fire environment. And what I've done here is I've laid over some of those fire perimeters that were observed in the early 1900s. And what you'll see is that some of these fire perimeters, specifically up around the gorge in Southwest Washington and Northwestern Oregon there, some of those big fire perimeters correspond pretty well with what I call these regional hotspots of dry east wind frequency. Up around the gorge there, you see along the crest of the Cascades in Oregon. They're not quite as high as they are up by the gorge, but they're much, much higher than across parts of the other region. Down in Southwest Oregon, the Brookings effect that drove the Chetco Bar fire, I think in 2017. Interesting to note, up in Northwest Washington, there were not many large fires in the early 1900s. If you remember back to some of those maps, it's generally cooler and wetter. It's more remote. Lightning is very, very rare, and these dry east winds are also less common. It's also interesting to note that these fires that we're seeing in the Coast Range that were in the 1850s and 1860s also don't necessarily correspond with one of these wind events. And the take-home point that I like to make here is that, you know, really on the west side, all the areas are prone to these large fires. And all it takes is one of these wind events in ignition to have the sort of situation that we had last fall. And sort of our best documentation, those early 1900s fires, we don't have a lot of instrumented weather data documenting wind speeds and relative humidity. But this Tillamook burn 1933 is really one of our most iconic fires. We do have observations, and this is just a map of daily fire spread from the 1933 fire. And, you know, the fire started in mid-August and sort of was skunking around, burning slowly. The relative humidities were up in the 40s for 50s, the winds 5 to 10 miles an hour for about a week there out of the west, so probably cooler and moister. And then what you see is on August 25th and 26th, the winds change, the relative humidity drops, and the wind speeds increase. And that August 25th to 26th, I think about 75 or 85% of the area that burned and that Tillamook fire burned in that one period. So certainly similar to what we saw in last fall, happened in 1933 in the Oregon Coast Range. Another sort of conspicuous thing when thinking about some of these early 20th century fires is there's a lot of evidence that they reburned. The Tillamook fire reburned, I think, 5 times in the next 20 years. I think it was the 6-year curse. There was a series every 6 years, 1933, 39, 40, 45, 51, 56. There were reburns all associated with early logging or railroads. The Yakult fire, which was part of the Columbia complex, that also hopped over the gorge, the Columbia burns in the Portland area, the Mount Hood area in 1902. This reburned, I think, 15 times in the next 50 years. Here you can see some of the perimeters, that 1929 Suisun burn being the big one. And so, you know, I did a little digging, and I think what happens is we have these large high severity fires in what is generally sort of a moist forest, old growth dominated landscape that can actually be very, very difficult to catch on fire. These old growth forests hold moisture and they stay cooler than these early xero landscapes. And I did some more digging around in the early literature, and this Neeland was a professor, I think, from University of Oregon, and went out and put temperature sensors in basically old growth areas and areas that had burned in the Tillamook burn, and found that maximum temperatures were 10 degrees hotter in burned areas following the Tillamook burn. And so if you think about the conditions that are out there today in some of these landscapes, that burned last fall, it's much, much hotter. It's much, much drier than we see in some of these closed canopy forests. So these are very, very important things to consider when thinking about the future here following those 2020 fires. This is a somewhat outdated figure showing recent fire trends. It only goes through 2017 in the Oregon Western Cascades. You'll see the big year 2017 is the Eagle Creek fire, which really sort of woke everyone up to Westside Fire. But what you'll notice is that 1985 to 2010, that fire rotation was over 1,000 years. And if you remember from the AG study in Bull Run, it was, historically, it was about 300 years. And so actually we've, with this period between 1985 and 2010, we had far less fire than we did historically. And of course, that 2017 fire sort of put the West Side on the map for fires, almost 50,000 hectares burned. And then of course, we had the 2020 West Side fires. And I think, almost 3,000 hectares burned. That's 6 times as much area that burned in 1917 or 2017. Really, really, really large, devastating fires. More area burned in a few days than in the last 50 years combined. The fires were much, much larger and more severe than other recent fires. Over half the area that burned did so at high severity fire. We had this combination, this unique weather combination of a late season drought. And so if you look at drought metrics from last summer on an entire summer basis, things weren't really that anomalous. They were fairly average. But what happened in those last couple of weeks of August was it got really, really, really hot and dry. And, fuels in the places where we had these large fires were 98th percentile in terms of how dry they were. And then, of course, we had a series of ignitions and these dry east wind events that drove those fires. And overnight, these landscapes were transformed. And, there's something that very few folks alive are very, very familiar with. We haven't seen these since the Tillamook burns really in the 30s and a little bit in Southwest Washington. But I think, our governor, Kate Brown, really nailed it when she called these generational events. They really are not that frequent, but they are a reality on these West Side landscapes, and they are characteristic of historical fire regimes. And if we look, this is a graph here, and I've plotted basically fire size on the x-axis. So going from left to right, you have small fires to large fires. And then on the y-axis, we have the proportion of the total area burned that was stand replacing, or essentially all the trees were killed. And the fires that happened between 1985 to 2019 are the blue dots, and the 2020 fires are the red dots. And it's just really clear how these fires stick out compared to the recent fires that we've experienced. An average of 60% of the area burned. You had almost 75 to 100% of the trees killed. Way, way larger than the past fires we have that have not been these weather-driven events. And so they truly are unique in terms of recent contemporary fires. And going back to some of those historical maps, when we put these 2020 fires in historical context, they are not really unprecedented historically. When those early explorers were looking out over these landscapes in 1902, there was evidence of similar size fires and even fires that were much, much bigger in size. The brown, we have the Coast Range from the 1850s. That pink there is the Tillamook from 1933. Of course, the red fires are the big five, as I call them, the 2020 fires. The blue is the 1902 Columbia Complex, which of course was the Yakult and Columbia burn into Oregon. The light blue is what may potentially be the Silverton fire of the 1860s. This fire is somewhat mythical. There's really no solid evidence that it existed. But we do have this almost 1 million acre fire perimeter that stretched from sort of the south flanks down to almost Salem on the Mount Hood National Forest. And what you'll see is that a lot of these areas that burned in 2020 also burned in the early 20th century. And I have on the left, I just have some figures of what I call fire-created early cereal habitat for sort of some perspective on what these 2020 fires have done to our landscape. And, you know, in 1902, based on these maps, about 20% of the west side, Oregon, Washington, was in this fire-created early cereal state, these hashed areas that you see across the region. By the 1930s, fires had decreased, and it was down to about 5% of the region. And then by the 2000s, it was less than 0.5% of the entire west side had experienced stand replacing fire recently. And so in 2020, the Oregon Western Cascades were at about 3%, right? And so we had these huge fires, but when you zoom out, they really only affected a small part of the total forested area. And we're really just sort of creeping back into that historical range of variability. And if you read some of the old accounts from the early 1900s, some of the mechanisms for why there was so much fire is that there were, you know, European colonizers and settlers everywhere. And every fall they would burn slash piles and clear land with fires. And, you know, that Columbia fires, there's clear precedence for one of these dry east wind events. And when you have all those ignitions and all those fires burning and you have one of those east wind events, you can see how devastating fire really can be at a regional scale. And so, you know, thinking about how these forests might recover, you know, I had some of those statistics for how much early cereal fire created habitat there was, and it declined pretty quickly. And historically, we think these fires have been very, very resilient to these large stand replacing fires. And when we think about some of the different strategies of fire response in terms of enhancing tree fitness, things like survival or reproduction, we can sort of break them into 5 different groups. And the first would be resistors. And so these sorts of species survive fires and generally have characteristics like really, really thick bark. They grow very, very tall. And so their canopies are elevated way above the rest of the forest canopy. And I have here a picture of an old growth Douglas fir. You can see how thick that bark is, you know, up to 5 or 6 inches. It insulates the bark from these fires that come through, and it really takes a big wind event in drought to get these trees to burn and to see mortality. Other species such as embracers are a little bit less common on the west side, but these generally have low tolerance to fire, thin bark, and they'll suffer through a crown fire and die, but they'll recover quickly through these canopy seed banks. So things like lodgepole pine or knobcone pine, which is really, really common in Southwest Oregon, have serotinous cones. These cones that generally stay closed until a fire comes through and warms them up and the seeds release. And one of the really, really interesting things you'll see, I have Douglas fir here with question marks following it, is some of the resilience they saw after those early 1900s fires. Some of the early scientists speculated that what happened was, you know, these late fall fires, by then Douglas fir cones are mature and they're way up, you know, a couple hundred feet potentially in the canopy, and a fire may go through and kill the tree. But if those cones remain unconsumed, even if the tree dies, they will open and drop seeds. So it's sort of like this one opportunity for regeneration where things don't have to come in from unburned areas. The third trait here, avoiders. These species have thin bark. They're easily killed by fire, but generally occur in places where fires are very, very rare. So these would be really, really wet places, things like western red cedar, or some of our high elevation forests, Engelmann spruce, subalpine fir, silver fir, noble fir, species like that. Endurers is the 4th category. Here's a picture of a sprouting big leaf maple. This is in the Tumblebug fire, and this huge patch of stand replacing fire. All these old growth Douglas fir have been killed. And this big leaf maple is conspicuously resprouting from the base. And so this other mechanism that some of these hardwoods have is to resprout and basically persist after fire. And then the 5th example, of course, is colonizers. So species that can disperse generally long distances, things like red alder that's wind dispersed. Douglas fir does pretty well with dispersal, and as does western hemlock. So these are species traits that you might want to think about in terms of how forests will respond to these recent fires. Some of the other considerations to think about are the size of stand replacing fire. You know, if you have a really, really large patch, like some of the things we had in 2020, if there were not stored seeds in the canopy, it's going to take a long time because seeds are going to have to disperse a long distance to the interior before they can regenerate. The seasonality of the fire, whether or not cones were mature in the canopy, certainly last fall, in early September, trees had mature cones in them, and if they were able to persist, may provide a source of cones. Productivity is really, really important. I have here 3 different pictures. One is from higher elevation forests, or sort of mid-elevation silver fir forests up on the upper left, and you can see this is about 15 or 20 years following the Warner Creek fire. Abundant regeneration coming back in this moist productive environment. To the right, I have a landscape from southwestern Oregon, another large patch of high severity fire, only about 5 years following fire. But again, those resprouting hardwoods come back really, really quickly, sort of emblematic of resilience to high severity fire. And then on the bottom, I have a high elevation forest. This is from the Waldo Lake area, the Trout fire in 1992. This is almost 30 years post-fire. We have a very, very short growing season, and it takes a long time for those trees to get established and even longer for them to grow and reach reproductive size. Other factors to think about, post-fire climate. You can imagine if there were Douglas fir seedlings out there after those fires last fall, those 115 degree days probably really took a toll compared to what we would have for normal summers and the temperatures and drought that seedlings might experience. Invasive species are a major concern. I mentioned the Bandon fires in the 1930s. These were largely the result of gorse, which is similar to Scotch broom that we have here on the west side. They're pyrogenic species. They have oils. They regenerate very, very densely in early cereal landscapes and have the potential to carry fire very, very rapidly, even under non-windy conditions. I think a major post-fire concern. And then state changes in the case of short-term repeated fires, where you have trees that may regenerate, but if they get burned up again before they reach maturity, they lack reproductive propagules that are local, and again are going to require regeneration from long distances. And so finally, you know, thinking back to some of the different fire regimes and some of the pre-fire management or adaptation options that we have to these, we've done a lot of thinking about this in low severity fire regimes in places where we've been putting out fires and fuels have accumulated. And I think we have a lot more option. Our basic go-to there is these stand level fuel reductions, where you can go out, reduce the density of trees, cut out those shade tolerance that have established since fire exclusion, and you can really, really have some effects at mitigating fire behavior and severity when a fire does roll through there. But when we think about this high severity fire regime, where we have fires that are driven by these winds, you know, you can do all the thinning you want, and it's not really going to affect fire behavior a whole lot. The dry fuels and the winds just supersede that. And so when we think about adaptation to fire on the west side, we think more about some of the things we can do to promote species and structural diversity. So encouraging hardwoods that really can foster resilience, even in those large high severity fires. Reducing other ecosystem stressors, invasives, and fragmentation in the landscape, so that things are closer and can regenerate faster, so seeds don't have to come from such a far distance. Aggressive wildfire and detection, especially during that window of vulnerability there when we know these wind events happen. Being able to reach ignitions and put them out promptly before fires can grow is going to be key. And if you think back, I guess I don't have this map now, but there were over 20 ignitions going on when that wind event happened in the west side, and they were able to put some of them out very, very quickly. On the east side in the Wasco Ranger District, the Wright River Fire was burning up until about the week before that wind event kicked up. And I hate to think of what might have happened if they were not able to get that event under control. And then finally, you know, developing post-fire response strategies. So knowing what you're going to do, having plans to go to when these sorts of events do happen. They're difficult to predict when and where, but if you know what you're going to do when they do happen, you're going to be in a better situation to respond quickly and adapt. And in terms of some of these post-management options, they're fairly similar across these different regimes. You want to assess the fire impacts in terms of your management objectives, and maybe early serial biodiversity is one of your managements, but maybe old growth is one of your management objectives. And so there's a flip side to all these things when you start thinking about the ecological effects. Leveraging national regeneration where you can, again, promoting structural diversity and species composition diversity with hardwoods, coordinating across different landowners with different objectives. And then using these events as learning opportunities, research, monitoring, trials. We don't know a whole lot about Westside Fire. Sort of everything I've given to you is based on papers that I've read that were published in the early part of the century. We just haven't had a lot to learn from. And so we'll really be doing a lot of that here in the next 10 to 20 or potentially 50 years. And so, of course, thinking about future fire activity, we know that it's going to be warmer and drier. There's all these different scientific studies that point to more fire activity, and they use different models to project that. The important thing to consider here is that none of them incorporate these dry east wind events, and that's really a big uncertainty when we think about future fire, and that how those wind events change in the future could really change how this map looks. And I think I'm sort of running out of time, so I'm just going to sort of put my conclusions up here. And give you a chance to look at those, and I'd be happy to take any questions that folks have.
All right, thank you, Matt. Yeah, that was really a great coverage. I've been trying to learn and study this in my 40-year career as a forester, and it's really neat to see it put together. And of course, last year's fires really kind of brought a lot of this home. That, yeah, this is not necessarily uncharacteristic fire, but we sure haven't seen it in a long time. Any questions for Matt at this point? Definitely want to encourage you to put your questions in the chat. But before we move on to the next talk about post-fire and salvage and other considerations, anything on your minds right now for Matt? I don't see anything in the chat. And I should point out our next session a couple weeks out is going to be focused on climate change and fire regime. So there'll definitely be a lot of overlap. That map you just showed about kind of projections of what do we expect to happen in terms of increased fire activity and the big wild card of what drives our east wind events. That seems like a really hot topic, and how to manage Westside forest, not only with fire, but climate change changes to fire regimes.
Yeah,
who's on the cutting edge of that?
Yeah, Dave and Jessica I just sort of scrape the surface with adaptation and climate change. I think Dave and Jessica will give you a lot more information. So hopefully this will be some good ecological background for thinking.
And I guess I would assume that in the post-fire environment, where you're talking about what's coming over the next 20 years, let's say for, stand recovery or forest recovery, I would hope that there's an awful lot of new research being started and monitoring of a lot of these burn scars.
Yeah, so I did. We have the Forest Service. We have this Westside Fire initiative that we started. I know both Becky and Morris are involved, and I sort of skipped that slide. But this was sort of a response to the Eagle Creek fire. So back in 2019, we had this big workshop where we sort of invited all these different partners and came up with a series of projects. And some of them are focused on fire history. Several of them are focused on post-fire regeneration. There's a lot based on social factors, so ignitions and things like that. Some modeling things about future fire. I won't spoil the surprise for Becky and Morris. Yeah, so we sort of had this big initiative, and then these 2020 fires came along, and we've sort of been, sort of reassessing, and everybody's sort of modifying their study designs to incorporate these as a learning opportunity, and thinking about how we can leverage them to think about how we might adapt to them in the future. So there'll be lots and lots of research coming out in the next couple of years.
All right. Well, very good. Thank you, Matt. And it's time to move on and give Morris his turn. So our next speaker is Morris Johnson. So go ahead and cue up your presentation, Morris, and welcome, and take it away.
Let's see if this works again here. So is it work?
Yeah, and you'll have to change it from presenter.
Okay, here we go.
There you go.
Okay, so great. Thanks for the invite. And it's great to follow Matt because he gave a pretty good introduction to basically what I'm working on. So once again, I'm Morris Johnson. I work for the PNW Research Station in Seattle as a research fire scientist. And usually what I like to do, because I give lots of presentations, I like to give a quick introduction of who I am and how I got to the Forest Service. So I'm originally from the South, so Louisiana. I went to undergrad in Louisiana. I have an undergrad degree. It's actually urban forestry. So I got lucky and got my job in the Forest Service by getting an internship. So I can still remember that one summer I took the Greyhound bus, 3 days out to Prospect, Oregon. And so I really started, before I moved over to the research side, I actually started my Forest Service career on the Prospect Ranger District as a silviculturist. So I was there in Prospect, Oregon, Southern Oregon, in training as a silviculturist. And then I moved up to Seattle to go to graduate school. But while I was in graduate school, I also did the Redding Hotshot crew and the Redding Hotshot crew. And then I moved into the research. And by starting off in Forest Service systems, I have a connection with the managers. And so my career really started off looking at, thinning treatments, what thinning treatments are most effective at changing fire behavior. So I started off basically doing these simulation modeling to say, okay, well, if you remove this many trees from the forest, it's going to be most effective at changing fire behavior. So kind of the stuff that Matt talked about on the east side, how many trees we need to remove to change fire behavior. And so I basically simplified it, basically, thinking about, you have these matches, and these matches are trees. And because of fire suppression, this is what a lot of the forests look like, right? So you have one tree to start, ignite, it's going to, basically become a crown fire. So what my research was looking at is, how many trees can we remove in order to maintain some type of habitat, but at the same time, change that fire behavior. But we also know that it's just a model, right? So what I, from the modeling, what I ended up doing was working with the managers after these large wildfires to basically to evaluate if the thinning treatments that they actually implemented were effective at changing fire behavior. So here's the 2011 Wallow fire. So you can see above the yellow line, that's untreated, and below is treated. And then, I think like 4 years after they did the thinning treatment, the fire comes down and you can see that untreated, 1% crown scorch. And you can see as they go into the treated area, that is a change in fire behavior. So what I do, I work with the managers to basically quantify were the thinning treatments effective at changing fire behavior, but most important, how big treatments need to be around these wildland urban interface communities. You can see all the houses here. How big the treatments actually need to be in order to change their fire behavior. San Juan Fire 2014, basically we did the exact same thing. We had a wildfire to start. We went and did these measurements, and we can tell you how big a thinning treatment needs to be in order to change fire behavior. This was also an impact of Sick Rays National Forest in Arizona. Moved over to the Bald Fire in Lassen National Forest. Lassen National Forest, we basically measured the exact same thing. Basically, thinning treatments need to be really, pretty big, about 400 to 600 meters in order to be effective at changing fire behavior. So because I visit lots of national forests and I'm on the district a lot across the US, what I noticed is, after the large wildfires, the next big question is, okay, so we have this landscape with all these dead trees, what do we do next? And that's really the big questions. And I think, following the 2020 wildfires, Mount Hood and a lot of the areas around this area, they had the exact same question. No, they had the exact same question in terms of what do we do after large wildfires? And the response is different really based on who you are, right? If you're a federal agency, you have a lot of boxes you have to check in order before you can do any type of management. Now, if you're a private forest, you can start doing salvage logging right away, right? Now, on the federal side, what we can do is we can, basically clear along the roadways. So most likely you will see along major highways that you will start seeing some type of management. But in terms of moving beyond, the roadways, roadside salvage, then we have to go through the NEPA process. And so really after the fire, the big question is, what's next? And I always like to use the quote from forest supervisor on the Mendocino National Forest. I've been working with the Mendocino National Forest since I think like maybe for like 3 years. And Ann Carson, we were giving an overview to the U.S. Congressman, and she said, after these large wildfires, there's a mix of perspectives on how to manage post-wildfire landscapes, and that is true. And if anyone knows, knows these mixed perspectives, is Ann. So the Mendocino National Forest in the last 3 years, 95% of the forest has burned. In 2018, the ranch fire burned 500,000 acres. And then the August complex in 2020 burned 1 million acres. So it burned across the Mendocino, burned across the Shasta Trinity, burned across the 6 rivers. And so these mix of perspectives, she said there's a mix of perspectives, but really it comes down to really 2 perspectives after these large wildfires. And I summarize them basically as, is those who are against salvage logging, right? And then those who are for salvage logging. And so if you are an opponent of salvage logging, you have your reasons why you are against any type of management. And then if you are for salvage logging, you have your reasons why you support it, right? And so my idea is, if you are against, post-fire management, then there are consequences to being against salvage logging and or passive management. And then there's consequences if you are for active management. And so what I do is I work with the manager, say, okay, well, if we're going to do, post-fire management, here's an example on the August complex. What I do is we basically collect some data and we simulate with the model FPS, and we say, okay, well, if you do not do, post-fire management, we want to look at, just one of the one consequence, and that is what's going to happen to fuels, dead woody fuels over time if you don't do salvage logging. And so the models, like I said, it's just a model. The models, it's pretty clear, says that you will have an increase in dead woody fuel loading. So that's what the green line represents. And then if you're going to do some type of active management, then the models basically show that depending on how many of the trees you remove, then you will still have some increase in dead woody fuel loading depending on how many of the trees you remove. So those next 2 lines basically represent the thinning treatment that one group suggested that we analyze, and that was, well, let's thin all trees up to 20.9 inches and leave everything else. And so you can see that over time that there's going to be an increase in woody fuel loading. And so having this increase in woody fuel loading, not only increases the woody fuel loading, it basically, we don't meet our management objective of basically trying to recover some of the economic value of the woody fuels, but we also probably change the balance of the post-fire fuel dynamics. So if you think about, if you don't do any salvage logging, you increase the woody fuel loading, and you think about what Matt talked about with the projection in climate change, and we're going to have this increase in wildfire. And Matt had a window. I have a Reburne window. So basically, within 10 years, we know that some of these forests are going to reburn. So if you don't have, if you decide not to do active management, you're going to have this increase in dead woody fuel loading. And if you have this increase in dead woody fuel loading, and you have a repeat wildfire, then most likely the reburn or the reburn wildfire is probably going to be more severe than the first wildfire. And so this is what I've been working with most of the managers with across the West. And so back in May, when I first took off to go out to the field, I had, let's see, this was 8 sites that I was supposed to visit. I think I end up installing plots on all but 3 of those. And so in blue, those are sites that I've done in the past. And so the idea is to work with the managers to basically, these are projects where we completed the NEPA analysis, environmental assessment, and we want to basically analyze what's going to be the effects of not doing salvage logging and what's going to be the effects of doing salvage logging. And so I basically work with the managers, and the idea is when we go through the NEPA process, we develop this IDT team. I become a member of the IDT team as a monitoring coordinator. And my idea is when we go through the NEPA process and we develop the purpose and need, we need to integrate a monitoring protocol, and not just a couple of pictures where we look at before and after, but we need to basically integrate a monitoring protocol that's based on the principles of an experimental design, right? Because we want to basically remove the bias. We want to analyze the true effects of no salvage logging versus salvage logging. And in this case, our response variable would be changing the fuels, changing seedlings, and changing shrubs in vegetation. And so what I've been able to do is basically we get this line item inserted into the purpose and need. And so here's one line item on the Walker Fire on the Clackamas National Forest from last year, and you can see we have this standard boilerplate purpose and need. We want to recover the economic value of the timber. We want to reduce the danger of future wildfires, but also we have this promote the scientific research regarding the effects of large wildfires. Kind of last couple slides that Matt talked about where we want to use these large wildfires as a learning opportunity. And then here's a simple example. This was on the Boise National Forest. But if you look up some of these NEPA documents, you will see some of this verbiage where I've been working with these national forests to basically use these fires as a learning opportunity. I think last year, this year, I'm on 7 IDT teams, and we've been working, the last 6 or 7 months trying to get through the whole NEPA process. And so what does this monitoring approach actually look like? So depending on what we finalize as the proposed areas that we're going to do the salvage logging. So how big our polygons are going to be in terms of how many acres we're going to salvage log. So we identify the polygons, and then all the specialists go out and then they basically start subtracting, right? So the fisheries biologists subtract, the soil biologists subtract, land. And so in the end, we come up with polygons that are reduced size and funny shapes. And so if that happens, then I end up basically doing a paired design. So here's an example where I put plots in the treated area, and then I look at some adjacent areas, and then I put plots there. And so this is basically comparing treated to untreated. Now, if the polygons are, what I consider, nice size where I can actually, put in some big fixed plots, then I will go with either a randomized block design. So I call it randomized block design 2.3 or randomized block design 5.4. And the 2.3 is 2.3 acres and 5.4 acres. And the difference is the 2.3 is 15 fixed area plots, and then the 5.4 is 24 fixed area plots. But it all depends on how big the polygons are. And so really quickly, what the randomized block design, so I should have taken this slide out, but anyway, so this is basically what we end up doing on the August complex. We went through and did this analysis to basically identify potential areas where we can actually do salvage logging. And out of these 15, pods, we basically selected 2. So I'm on the IDT team on the Mendocino National Forest. So we selected one on the Mendocino National Forest, which is down here. And then I'm on the IDT team on the Shasta Trinity National Forest. So we selected one up here. And so all of the other areas, we did not pursue salvage logging. So randomized block design on the Mendocino National Forest, Placer Keller, randomized block design. So in the end, we end up with like 3,000 acres. And here are the polygons. And you can see that, we have some pretty big polygons, nice size. And you can also see that we have some pretty small polygons. We have some funny shaped polygons. And one thing that's not in here are the roads. But my proposal was, here are, if we're going to go, if these are our final polygons, this is going to be my randomized block design. So I basically install the randomized block design. So in this case, it'll be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 blocks, and basically, 5 blocks in these different polygons, and each block has 3 cut units, right? And so in this case, we went with the 2.3 acres. So each cut unit is 15 fixed area plots. And so we install each block has 3 cut units, and then we randomly assign the treatments. So in block 5, out of the 3 cut units, we randomly assign one of those cut units a control, and then we randomly assign 1 full salvage, and we randomly assign 1 partial salvage. And so then in each cut unit, which is 2.3 acres, so here our basic study objectives just mentioned that we want to establish a replicated long study monitoring project, and we want to look at pre and post, and then we want to look at what happens over time, because we have cut units and we have salvage control units. And then here are some of the research questions for this project. So this is an example of the 5.4, but at each plot center, we have 4 brown transects. The first transect is random, and then each transect, we measure basically the dead woody fuel loading on the ground. So we're counting the 1 hour, 10 hour, 100 hour, 1,000 hour fuel. All fuel that's 1,000 hour, we measure the DBH and the diameter. We also look at shrubs and non-woody. We don't look at litter and duff because it's salvage logging. We can talk about that later. And we do this in the control units, and we do this in the treated areas, and we do this after they do, before they do the salvage logging, and then we do it after they do the salvage logging. And so this is basically looking at the 1 hour fields, and 1 hour field loading in the middle, and 10 and 100 hours on the left, and then it's the 1,000 hour. And at the end point of each of the transit, we also put a 18-inch conduit, because when we come back and remeasure, we want to remeasure the same transect. And so if there's a change in woody fuel loading, from decomposition, we hope to pick up that with these woody fuel lines. And so we also have a protocol for looking at shrubs. So we can do in quadrants, and we can also do line intercept. And so what we can do initially, after we get the pre-treatment data, we can use the model again, and we can make projections based on the pre-treatment initial basal area. And so we can basically plot that over time. So here's an example so I have these plots on the El Dorado National Forest and the Mendocino National Forest and the Boise National Forest. And so what we show here is on the Mendocino National Forest, initially, we can see that over time, the Mendocino, because obviously the Mendocino, the initial basal area was higher than the El Dorado. And we can see that over time, within 20 years, it would tell us the total loading that's going to be, that we anticipate to be on the ground in these forests without active management. And so remember, I like using models, but I always tell people that it's just a model. And so the idea is we take this model, we make these projections over time. So here's the El Dorado, Mendocino, plumas. And then what we do is within 5 years and then 10 years, we go back and remeasure, and we actually get the actual number of the loading, and then we can compare it with what the model actually predicted. And then we can basically calibrate to see if the model prediction is really, really off, or if it's really under predicting, then that's really not good, because within 10 years, this is a lot of dead woody fuel loading on the ground. And I don't think the managers, I don't think they're gonna really like that. But and so in the end, we can also come up with these regression analysis to basically look at post-fire, base area loadings, and then we can make projections on how much loading is going to be on the ground, and then that would help managers make decisions on what they should do, if they don't do salvage logging. Because believe me, I have lots of plots where we did not do salvage logging, but just because you don't do salvage logging, you still have a potential fuels problem, because now the managers have to say, okay, well, we weren't able to do salvage logging, but we still need to treat the fuels. And so they can use these models to basically say, within this area on Mendocino National Forest, we need to think about treating the fields there if we want to, replant. Because remember, after large stand replacing wildfires, the goal is always to get, to replant, right? Not just to extract the timber. The goal is always to get the forest back into green forest. And you can't do that if you have, increased wooded field areas. And so just early results. So here's results on the Colville National Forest that we did a couple of years ago. And what we show is that the Colville, it was, there was an increase in 1 hour and a 10-hour fuels and the 100-hour fuels, but it really wasn't significant. One of the reasons why that was not a big increase, we didn't see a significant, what I would consider a really significant increase in wooded field loading, is because the pre-treatment stand basal area was pretty low, because these stands were, I think the biggest tree we measured was like, I don't know, 14, 15 inches. And so if you project those over, if you project the control units over time, the post-fire field succession loading is going to be low. And so by doing salvage logging, we, there was a, like I said, you can see that there was an increase, but it wasn't really significant. So, and then we are in the Colville tribe, Confederate tribe. We basically come up with the same results. What we had here was we had control, and then we had 2 thinning treatments, but implementing RX2 and then RX3. So we were supposed to thin down to 3.4 square foot of BA and 10.5. But it's really difficult to implement these different treatments based on square basal area. And so we end up having to combine FS and STH, because the response was really the same in terms of what actually ended up being implemented in the forest. So we end up with basically control and just really one treatment, because we end up combining. But this paper is still in review. And then I think that is it. Questions, comments?
Thank you, Morris. I think in the interest of time, let's go to Becky's talk, and then we will have the time for discussion afterwards. And I'm kind of curious. I'll have questions for you then for sure.
Okay.
So thank you. And then let's switch gears and go to Becky.
Hey everybody, thank you so much for the invitation and to be able to be here this evening. So I'm going to be talking about the effects of wildfire on aquatic species and water quality as well. Matt and Morris have both set the stage talking about fire return intervals and pathways for wildfire in western forests and some of the management considerations that we might have after fire with Morris. And I'm going to just review a bit of what we understand about the importance of wildfire in aquatic systems. But first, I really want to recognize a lot of people who contributed to this work, some of the analysis and studies that are going to be discussed, and some of the ongoing research collaborations. So I just want to recognize and acknowledge them here right at the beginning. So the 2020 fire season, right? Matt talked about that quite a bit. And that fire season really, I think, did a good job of reminding many of us who live in the West Side that we live in a fire-formed landscape. Historically, wildfire being a really important and large-scale disturbance process that contributed to the complexity of our landscapes and the habitats that are contained within them. And Matt showed us a lot of maps, but I love this picture. This is the Oregon Coast Range in 1936 from Hoffman, Southwest. And you can look out over this landscape of the Oregon Coast Range, and you can see the variety of age classes and stand sizes. And you can see the fire-scarred trees in the foreground there. So fire being a really important mechanism for landscape scale, complexity, and it was a primary disturbance process in the West. And now Oregon Coast Range, right, very often our primary disturbance process that we see and that we're aware of is timber harvest and how we are managing our landscapes. But that's really changed many of our systems. And some of the questions that we have about the effect of wildfire when we don't have that kind of historic mosaic, we have more managed, timber managed landscapes, an open question, I think. So I'm going to talk about rivers and what does fire do to rivers? Well, I think it's really important to start with the concept that rivers are dynamic. They are dynamic over time. They're seasonally dynamic. We have low flow and high flow. Floods are a natural part of the cycle of river systems. And in our estuaries, we have daily cycles of high and low flow associated with tides. So our rivers are an incredibly dynamic place to begin with. And wildfires interact with that dynamism in some really important ways for aquatic ecosystem complexity. This is the Riverside Fire, and I brought this up because I wanted to show that even a fire as intense as the Riverside Fire in your own backyard here had a mixture of fire severities. A lot of high severity burn, that dark brown, the moderate in kind of a pink color, low severity in white, and then unburned in blue. So even in an area like the Riverside Fire that had such intense fire effects, we do have a mosaic of fire intensities that's going to result in a mosaic of stand conditions into the future. But what does that mean for fishes? So this is the Fish Creek drainage. This system burned at either high or moderate intensity fire through pretty much the entire catchment. This has been a really high, a really beautiful section of stream, highly protected watershed. And we can see that the fire burned right through the riparian area, which I would have expected. But we can also see, and these photos were taken at the beginning of this summer, that we're starting to see some greening up. And I'm also seeing a lot of downed wood. And that's going to be an important part of the story and what fire can do for aquatic systems. I'll talk about that in just a minute. So post-fire events in streams and riparian areas. So when we lose canopy, we often see stream heating as a consequence of wildfire. We can see debris flows and torrents that increase turbidity and fine sediment concentrations in waterways. Very often we'll see debris flows, not necessarily immediately following fire. It can take 3 to 5 years for trees that were killed during a fire to lose their rooting strength and to start to fall down. So, we can see debris flows sometimes immediately, particularly if you have a strong series of winter storm events, or you might see a torrent and debris flows in the next few years following a wildfire. Those debris flows and torrents contribute a huge amount of wood and coarse sediment into stream channels. And in those early time period following fire, we might see changes in turbidity and a lot more fine material being contributed to stream systems. So these are some of the anticipated effects that we would see from wildfire. But what is really interesting, I think, is that we often think about post-fire effects as being immediate. And some of those post-fire effects in waterways and for our aquatic ecosystems are immediate, turbidity and washing off of ash and other material into the streams that usually happen in the first winter or two after wildfire. But if we think a little longer, we can see that there are different processes at work in streams after wildfire. And so those physical processes, the sediments and the wood material and the sunlight, and these pieces are often the ones that we focus on the most. And we see increases in suspended sediments. increases in large wood, increases in thermal conditions after a fire. But in the years after fire, that recovery period after fire, we start to see those numbers starting to come down very, as systems start to recover. But what those materials and those the large wood and the rocks and all of these pieces do to streams, these are the building blocks of complex habitat in aquatic systems. So they play a very important role in maintaining the complexity of our aquatic systems over the longer term. And you can see that when we start looking at the biological response to wildfire. We'll see declines early on in fishes and other organisms as they are affected by some of these disturbance events, some of the debris flows and landslides that come through. But then we often see a rebound in our fishes and our other biota in the several years after a wildfire. And they're responding to increased amounts of primary productivity. There's a lot of litter in the stream and a lot of nutrients coming in and a lot of more sunlight. So we have higher productivity in streams, which can be a real benefit for our fishes and our other organisms that live in the streams. So complex sets of interactions here between physical processes and biological responses post-wildfire in aquatic systems. So we know that riparian vegetation, the shrub and forb cover can respond really quickly after fire. This again is a photo from Fish Creek in your watershed. And you can see that the alders that were not killed by fire are already greening up this year. The shrubs, forbs are starting to green up as well. Thermal response takes a bit longer. This is some work we did in a study in the Wenatchee River system. And we looked at the effect of wildfire on stream temperature. And we used MODIS satellite imagery in order to be able to capture the thermal condition pre and post fire under different intensities of wildfire. And we found that in high intensity wildfires, we would still see a thermal signal in streams as many as 6 years after a wildfire, and even moderate intensity wildfire, 5 years. Low intensity wildfire often looks very similar to the no fire situation. So that time period that it takes for trees and vegetation to regrow, and for small streams, we see that thermal impact of fire is shorter because it doesn't take as long for the tree canopy to cover the stream after the fire. But in larger streams, it can take quite a bit longer. What does all this mean for some of our fishes? So this study, which I think is a really interesting one, this study is how you save your postdoc when a wildfire burns up your study. That's what this study is about. So this is work by Amanda Rosenberger. And she was looking at Rainbow Trout Life History University in Idaho. And this is her pre-fire data. So found no sexually mature young of the year fishes, and just a few 1-year-olds, and they were males that were mature. And then you start to see more mature fishes at age 2. Well, in the portion of her study system that burned, she started to see sexually mature young of the year fish, males, and quite a few 1+ fishes that were sexually mature. And what was really interesting was that in those places that were both burned and had debris flows that destroyed the river system, she saw a new life history emergence that we didn't know existed. We didn't know that this adaptation to wildfire was even on the table. There were young of the year female and male fishes that were sexually mature. So they were rebuilding the population. Even those very young fish were starting to do that. So we automatically think of wildfire as being a devastating and potentially catastrophic effect on our fishes, but particularly our native fishes that evolved with wildfire have adaptations and some of them we don't even fully understand yet, to major disturbance processes like wildfire and debris flows. This is another study looking at populations in a couple of streams. This is red band trout in Idaho. And the fire occurred right after the scientists here had done their assessment. And then the landslide occurred a year later. But within 5 years of the landslide, the population numbers at both of these sites was higher than it had been before the wildfire. And the authors of this study attribute that increase in population and increase in capacity of the stream to support fishes being due to the inputs that came into the stream as a result of that landslide, the large wood and the sediments. Because if you think about it, rivers are always working. They're always moving sediments and material downstream. So if we don't have inputs of material into the stream, they just become very simple over time, simplified. But that doesn't mean that wildfire is always going to be good for fishes everywhere, right? So this is a really interesting figure that Jason Dunham developed a couple decades ago now, looking at how do we think about the vulnerability of populations of fishes to wildfire. And his idea was that fishes that have highly specific habitat needs, and if that habitat is degraded and isolated and small sizes of habitat across the landscape, that those populations of fishes will likely have greater vulnerability to fire than those fishes that are less specified in their habitat needs, have more intact and less isolated habitats. They would have less vulnerability to wildfire. So we took that conceptual framework and we did some modeling with in the Wenatchee River system of bull trout who are highly specific in their habitat needs. They need very cold water. And then we also looked at spray chinook, another endangered Pacific salmon, but that lives in the lower portions of river systems, those areas that are more likely to be connected habitats, rather than headwater areas where bull trout occupy that have the potential to be isolated, particularly if you have debris flows or other types of events that come through. So bull trout, as I said, a cold water fish, they're a predator. They have a migratory or a resident life history, and they only occur in 21% of their historic range. And within areas of their current distribution, they are generally listed as threatened. Chinook salmon, we know about Chinook where we live in the Pacific Northwest, one of the largest Pacific salmon. They're anadromous, so they go to the marine environment. They're listed as threatened or endangered in much of their range as well. So these are the model results for bull trout. And the orange and the dark brown, you can see are up in the upper headwater areas of the Wenatchee River system. So the higher up in the system you go, the more potential for isolation. In the Wenatchee, those are also the areas that have the highest intensity fire events that we would have expected in that system. And the places with lower vulnerability for bull trout are associated with connected habitats where if a subpopulation is wiped out by wildfire, there's greater recolonization potential and opportunity for other fishes to take advantage of that rejuvenated aquatic habitat. When we looked at this with climate change, which is anticipated to affect thermal conditions in streams, we can see that the patch sizes of available habitat for bull trout really get smaller. And in this case, any fire is going to have potentially catastrophic consequences for those local populations of fishes. That's particularly true because we're seeing fire sizes increase. So under future climate scenarios, when we anticipate smaller patches of habitat for bull trout, then we would anticipate the ability of a single fire to be able to wipe out entire populations of these fishes. So these results for bull trout, which have the potential to be quite negative for some of the subpopulations to the immediate effect of fire, contrast what we found for spring chinook. So for these fishes that occupy lower river systems that are connected, the effect of wildfire and the wood and the sediment that we would expect after wildfire resulted in a fairly dramatic predicted increase in the quality of juvenile rearing habitat. And this was the most limiting habitat for a life stage in the Wenatchee River system. We saw a decline in egg and fry habitat due to fines, but the overall increase for the population in terms of rearing capacity for those juveniles meant that spring Chinook would have a likely a very positive response to wildfire over the long term. So how do we think about, so some of the concepts I've been talking about with fishes and fire are starting to, we're starting to apply them to think about water quality for human consumption. So how do we think about, we've been doing a lot of modeling and a lot of work to understand the effect of fire on fine sediments and coarse sediments and wood and other sorts of characteristics, temperature. Some of these characteristics being very important for our water treatment facilities and how we think about the vulnerability of human municipalities to wildfire and what it can do to those systems. And so this figure from Kevin Bladen looking at how we protect water quality from wildfire and his response variables, I think quite relevant to some of the work that we're starting to engage in associated with the Westside Fire Initiative that both Matt and Morris have been talking about. So Kevin talked about the need for actionable science for watershed management and community infrastructure and treatment infrastructure operations and policy decisions and trade-offs, and all of these being important responses that we can make to ensure resilience in our municipal water supplies. And the top two, actionable science and watershed management, are ones that we can start to speak to with the tools that we developed to understand the effect of wildfire on fishes. So what we're bringing to the table in some of the modeling work that we're doing is the ability to model surface erosion and sediment delivery, streams, gully erosion, landslide potential, channelized debris flow potential, flash flood potential, all of this linked to wildfire predicted burn intensity. And we're doing this work in two watersheds, and one of them is the Clackamas. So you may start to hear about some of our modeling products coming out soon. The other is the upper portion of the Rogue River system. So the Clackamas models are ones that we're starting to work on right now. And what those models are going to look like, something sort of like this. So these are the models that we can develop to understand how fire might affect erosion potential in different landscapes based on the fire intensity, the steepness of the slope, the type of soil, and the vegetation that's there. We can route that erosion into the stream channels, and then we can grade it down the stream to see how those types of disturbance events could affect downstream processes as well. And that allows us to identify places on the landscape that may be real hotspots for erosion that has the potential to have a negative effect on water treatment facilities because we might see a lot of particularly fine material associated with them. And it also allows us to identify those places where we might expect to see erosion that's going to be very beneficial to fishes, right? Or places where we have isolated vulnerable populations of fishes and we would want to try to protect them from some of the more negative consequences of wildfire. So these types of tools and data sets can help us streamline and be strategic in how we approach remediation on the landscape, particularly associated with roads. That's one of the biggest drivers for disturbance processes that can have negative effects on water quality and fish. So the models that we're starting to work on and develop can help inform some of the thinning or prescribed fire efforts that might be done in some places, where we can identify the forest roads that we might want to target for to be moved or to have catchment basins or such installed before we might expect to see fires. And it also helps us post-fire identification of places where we would want to target road restoration or other sorts of features that might help us contain some of the fine sediments that could be a more of a problem for municipal water supplies. We're going to be providing this information and maps and products, not just in reports, but we're going to be using story maps as another tool to try to share some of this information to be most useful for managers and stakeholders and understandable. So as I said before, you might start to see some of these products coming out. And just to summarize this, we've developed tools and models that help us understand disturbance processes, particularly fire, and how it affects fish. And now we want to try to be able to use some of those same tools to help us understand water quality and protect water quality for municipal watersheds as well. We've learned that wildfire can have a positive effect on fish habitat in the long run, but also that for fishes, the response to wildfire reflects their life history characteristics and the quality of their pre-fire habitat and population status. And over the next several months, we're going to continue to engage with water providers and partners to hear more about what their needs are and to make sure that we can help generate some useful material to respond to their questions. And with that, that's the end of my presentation. And I think we've still got a little time to answer questions for the whole group.
All right, very good. Thank you, Becky. Yeah, we do have time. We're just about right on time for how we figured this would go. And I think I just had a few things I was going to say to add to this before we open it up for the Q&A. In terms of anybody here in the audience and also anybody because of the devastating effects of fire in some of our communities and for people in the Riverside Fire in the Clackamas area, as well as elsewhere in Oregon. I just wanted to point out that if you or anyone needs help with post-fire assistance in terms of restoration, forest restoration, your landscape or your property, that you can start with OSU Extension Service. Find me through just Clackamas County Extension, and also the fire team, the Extension fire team, more statewide. We've developed a lot of resources for both, before wildfire preparation, fire preparedness, during wildfire information for us all. And the next time this might happen in our neighborhood and being more prepared, and also then post-fire restoration, reforestation, those kinds of things. So we have just look at OSU Extension Fire Program, and there's a real gateway to all kinds of great resources there. And I guess I could give that to, I will share my screen real quick, or just copy this and give it into the chat. I'll just put it into the chat for the fire program website, just for y'all to find. But it's really easy to find if you just search for OSU Extension to find us, or the fire program. And of course, the Clackamas River Basin Council, certainly working together with partners to help people that have questions about fire or post-fire recovery. So with that, I want to just open it up for questions and see if there's anything in the chat. I actually don't see much. Todd, have you seen anything in the chat as far as Q&A?
I've not seen any questions in the Q&A.
All right, well, we certainly covered a lot of different topics, and I did kind of start things going with Matt in the first part of that in terms of the fire history and the fire behavior and kind of what's coming in the future. And Becky, you were talking about some of the research that you're doing in the Clackamas. I'd just be kind of curious to know the bigger picture of, given the amount of fire that's happened in the Clackamas with the 36 pit fire and now the Riverside Fire. Can you give us an idea of just what all, was going on in terms of research? We haven't been able to get up there into the burn area, but I know that some researchers are getting up there. So you've got some of the studies that you're talking about. What else is kind of going on? Both you or Matt or Morris, kind of what we can look for in terms of the key, research that might be going on in some of the post-fire studies.
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. And for the Clackamas, I'm most familiar with the pieces of work that I'm involved with. So one of them, as I said, is this modeling study to help us try to identify places of vulnerability in the landscape post-fire that we might want to target for restoration that could have a negative effect on water quality. At the of time, we'll be able to identify those places where disturbances may have a positive effect on aquatic habitat. So it's a nice juxtaposition of those two elements together in the modeling work that we're doing. I have a new graduate student who's going to be starting in fall, who's going to be likely doing work at Fish Creek. We have pre-fire fish population work that's been done in that system. And the pictures that you saw was from some scouting that we did at Fish Creek to look at the intensity of the burn and to help deploy temperature sensors with folks from the National Forest out there. So looking at thermal conditions and changes in Fish Creek and proper, as well as hopefully trying to understand fish population response to fire starting next year. We weren't able to get in this year due to fire hazard trees post in that, that early time after the fire, but that's something that's going to be ongoing for us to try to better understand that system as well. And I believe, was it Glenn or Dave that you had mentioned that USGS has a temperature system up kind of at the mouth of the Clackamas down by Fish Creek that to be able to look at that long term. So some thermal modeling and monitoring after fire as well. And I think there's some other work that's being done but I'm not as familiar with some of those pieces. Dave, do you know more?
That's correct. The USGS just put in a real-time water temperature and several other parameter monitoring station there at the beginning of the summer, and it's currently collecting data. And then I believe the U.S. Forest Service might have one that's been installed periodically in the past, and I don't know if they were able to get in there, but at least USGS has got something.
Yeah, the Forest Service had about 6 temperature tidbits in Fish Creek that had been out there before the fire. So I've been able to go out and to replace some of those now this summer. So we'll see what some of those thermal effects are down the line. But another thing I would mention is that there are, there's also quite a lot of work associated with the fires that occurred in other portions of the Cascade Range, particularly associated with turbidity and thermal modeling and fish population work as well. So that whole series of fires, including the Riverside Fire and the Clackamas and some of those other fires, have really led to quite a few studies being implemented, and USGS is coordinating across a lot of those studies, as far as I can tell.
All right.
How about you, Matt?
Yeah, in terms of post-fire studies and the 2020 fires, it's from the ecological perspective and plants and regeneration. A lot of it is focused on regeneration and looking at distance to surviving trees and patch sizes and things like that, and sort of early serial trajectories. We have a fire history study that's going in, and some of those places where they're salvaging along roads, it's a good opportunity to look at fire history going back several hundred years with some of those stumps. But yeah, most of those studies are looking at regeneration, and then there are some other ones that are looking to the future, not specifically in terms of the 2020 fires, but using some climate change scenarios to look at the potential for large fires and socioeconomic factors that are contributing to ignitions and things like that. I think that's most of the focus.
All right, thanks.
So Glenn, I don't know if you saw the question that's on the chat from Nancy asking, is there any information available about the effects that dams have had upon fire behavior?
I can try to say something about this one a little bit. So I've been working with the Clackamas Waters partners and some of their questions about wildfire is, particularly in terms of water quality, is what what role the dams are playing, particularly as sediment, like filters, settling ponds, essentially, for fine particulates that might be coming down and washed down from upstream that could have an effect on the water supply downstream. And so in the modeling work that we're doing for the Clackamas right now, we're including the location of the dams and the reservoirs that are created above them to try to understand the flow paths for sediment and how that's being influenced by the location of those features in the streams. In terms of affecting fire behavior, I'm guessing the dams wouldn't necessarily affect fire behavior. They have created reservoirs above them rather than rivers. So I don't know if, I don't know what the consequence of that is on how fire might be moving through the landscape.
One thing I might observe about that is the way that these east wind events and the downflow of the wind in the canyons. I was talking with Daniel Lavelle, one of our fire specialists at OSU, who's got a lot of experience observing fire behavior on the fires. And basically that kind of wind-driven fire, those canyons, those deep canyons became actually the river of the wind, drove the fire down the canyon. And in some cases, the riparian or the bottom of the canyon was the first fire that got there, and then it went up the ridges. And so I can imagine that large reservoirs really would change the wind behavior as it funnels out of the mountains and down the canyons. And I would expect it might, actually, I'd be curious to know. I don't know what that effect is, but that's very different from obviously a river canyon without a dam, as opposed to a big broad reservoir and how that wind would behave, which is then the primary driver of fire. So I think that'd be interesting to look into.
Yeah.
One thing I could add to that is just having worked out in the upper Clackamas for quite a few years is that if you've been to the North Fork Dam, which upstream of it is quite an extensive fetch of a long reservoir, the winds there are almost like living in Troutdale. I mean, it's very unusual. I mean, when you think about where we are, we're usually buffeted or from the east wind effects, on an average basis. But when you're up there, it's all the time, or a significant amount of time you're getting those winds. So you can imagine when you have the east winds effects, that it can exacerbate that even more, to the extent that you saw what happened last year, where you had 17 miles of forest fire in one day. It's pretty significant.
So actually those open bodies of water increase the wind in some of the canyons, depending.
It seems like it, because there's less roughness. It's just
it's a fetch, as you said. Yeah. Very good. Actually, I have a question for Morris. You were talking about the kind of the studies that go in on looking at comparisons, of outcomes in terms of salvage logging or not. And that ID team, of course, has all the other disciplines represented. But you didn't talk about many of those studies in Oregon. I would think that kind of data is really going to be important over time, really objective information about all the different aspects of effects of salvage logging, and you focus on fuels. So are any of those kinds of studies or monitoring going in some of these Oregon fires?
Yes. So I have, I have a paired design on the Archer Creek fire on the BLM Roseburg district, and I have a paired design on the Archer Creek fire on Umpqua National Forest. So I was on the IDT team there, and then I have a randomized block design on the Beecher Creek fire on the BLM Northwest Oregon district. And then I have a paired design on the Checo Bar fire on the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest. So that's the scrambling that Matt talked about, because we put in for the west side, and my initial proposal was to look at something else, and then we had the 2020 wildfires, and I said, oh, no, I don't want to do that. I want to work with the managers directly. So then I scratched all of that and said I'm going to do the randomized block design stuff.
And then I would assume, like the other disciplines, along with your research on the fuels and the falling the wood, basically, and the fuels, then other researchers are studying the other aspects of the ecosystem and its recovery. Is that going on as well?
Not
Not in association with your plots.
No,
Okay.
no. Everyone has different we
Study
put in-
design.
Yeah, different study design. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, but I'm sure they're out there too.
Yeah.
Are there any other new questions that have come up? We're kind of about out of time here. Just want to encourage everybody, to tell your friends about the Clackamas River series here, the Journey Down the Clackamas, and the recording of this that'll be available, as well as reach out to us if you have questions in the future. How to reach Matt and Becky and Morris at the Forest Service and through me. I did want to point out too what Cheryl mentioned, that another key partner. If you look at Extension or the Clackamas River Basin Council, we're just a gateway to all the different sources of assistance and connecting you with knowledge or assistance regarding fire. So, the Soil and Water Conservation District, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, a lot of other folks out there that are ready to help. Our Small Woodlands Association, whom Dave Bugney is a member, really eager to help their neighbors in terms of forest landowners in the Clackamas as well. So, with that, I guess I should point out that we have another session coming up in 2 weeks that's really going to focus on climate change and, kind of and also in relation to fire and what may be coming and what we know about that and how we might look forward to, understanding changes on the Clackamas. And there's a link to register. I think Todd will put that in the chat, but you probably all know where it is. And just thanks to Matthew and Rebecca and Morris for putting this together for us tonight. And fitting within our time schedule on an evening. And so also thanking our sponsors that I mentioned at the beginning, our gold sponsors, the Recycling Co-op, the Clackamas Water Environment Services, and also the Clackamas River Water Providers at Metro and the Geological Society of the Oregon Country. So thanks for joining us tonight. And if you want to help, there's donations welcome from anybody to help support this program. So thanks again to our presenters and David or Todd, do you have any last words?
Other than excellent job, you three or four, and I sure appreciate all the effort you put into it. And thank you again.
All right. Well, you're welcome. And looking forward to what's next, and learning continues. So good night, everybody. And I'll see you next time.
Thank you, Glenn.
You're welcome.